Bonjour. Um, I really do be doing lives now just because I hate Lint, just because I hate editing. And I want to get these points out here for people that have been victims of abuse and need to hear it. And also in hopes that people will reflect on their own behavior because ultimately this whole situation goes a lot deeper than the horse world and it's normalized outside of the horse world. But I wanted to give an update and also just talk about how people defend abusers because I don't think a lot of the people doing this actually realize what it is that they're doing or how their language that they use makes the world a safer place for abusive people. And I've been noticing a lot of parallels between how horse people defend abusive horses and also some of the responses to the recent posts that I did about the threats that I was getting and how they seek to put the onus on victims to control how they respond to things to avoid getting abuse. With horses, we see this justified by the horses being dangerous, so I have to react this way with this level of harshness to stop them from being dangerous. And there's this implication that there's no other means around that. With situations like what's going on with my own, I've had people be like, oh, well, this is why you don't talk about politics. This is why you shouldn't criticize people. And that in itself is basically telling people you need to walk on eggshells, monitor your own behavior to avoid getting threats of violence against you and your animals. And I have a big problem with that, both as someone who has been in abusive relationships myself and someone who has witnessed people I love be in abusive relationships, and also just someone that cares about people and animals, because this entire narrative of telling victims of abuse how they should behave in order to avoid abuse takes all of the accountability off of the abuser and puts it onto people who are being abused to tell them that you need to control how you react to avoid this abuse. And it also just simply isn't true. Speaking from experience with my personal relationships that I've had that were very emotionally abusive, I would go to therapy. I would plan for weeks, thinking in my head scenarios over and over again, how to really carefully curate the words that I say to bring up issues that in a healthy relationship should just be an easy, quick conversation without rage and anger, and try to bring them up in a way to avoid triggering my abusive partners. And no matter how much I tried to walk on eggshells, the very notion of saying, hey, you did something that made me uncomfortable, or hey, you hurt my feelings in this aspect, or hey, this isn't okay. You can't treat people like this. Just the notion of criticizing behavior was enough to cause an abuser to fly off the handle and blame me for their behavioral response. Like basically every normal discussion about basic things, basic respect, basic treatment in a relationship, any criticism of on not okay behavior or holding them accountable, even for things that are just obviously out of line, like them ditching plans with me to go hang out with their friends and just not caring about stuff that was important to me, disrespecting me, bringing up these little issues and being like, hey, this isn't okay, I need you to treat me better, and doing so calmly was met with yelling and screaming. And then I was blamed for the fact that they reacted in that way, despite the fact that the only way that I could avoid that reaction is by never voicing my needs. And when people fixate on how you should behave to avoid abusive behavior, it's telling abusers that their behavior is okay and that it was incited by the people who made them feel triggered instead of making their emotional response their responsibility. Because regardless of how someone criticizes or how they come across, threats of violence against people and animals are never okay. And screaming in someone's face for bringing up a basic issue or like someone that you're supposed to care about, that's never okay. And I see this repeatedly justified in the horse industry and outside of it. And it makes the world a safer place for abusers. And it also makes victims feel less heard and more alone in their issues because they're perpetually being told how they should change their behavior in order to avoid being treated abusively, instead of abusers being told that their behavior is not acceptable and that they cannot do that. And this is something that impacts everybody because a lot of the people who justify this type of behavior might end up being victims of abuse in the future. Or they might already be in an abusive relationship and hyper normalizing those behaviors because of what people around them are saying. So it's something that impacts everyone and it extends past just liking someone on the internet and believing in what they say. So regardless of how people feel about me and my content, this is something that impacts everybody, where there's this narrative that it's up to the individual to alter their behavior to avoid an abusive response instead of looking at these responses and going, that's never okay. the vast majority of people on those posts are being totally reasonable and recognizing the fact that regardless of how you feel about someone, threats of violence are not okay. But there are a fair number of comments that are like, this is why you shouldn't bring up politics. This is why you shouldn't have started it. You brought this on yourself. And no, I didn't bring anything on myself, because people threatening detailed threats on how to hurt me and my animals is never okay. It's never justified. No matter, even if I had gone into this and used and it personally insulted someone and said something that's petty and nasty, which I did not do, that still doesn't justify personal threats of violence. It's never justifiable. People should never do that. And we shouldn't be picking and choosing when we feel violence is acceptable based off of how much we like someone, how much we believe in what they say, because that's just that type of treatment's never okay. Trying to make people feel fearful about what opinions they voice out of fear of violence is never okay. I also think that there's some pretty major irony in the fact that a lot of the people who are saying that I brought this violence on myself are the same people who say that someone like Charlie Kirk didn't deserve the violence enacted on him. My concern with this is that a lot of people are responding to these threats with a really flippant mindset, and this mindset that it's up to me to alter my behavior to avoid such threats because they don't believe that they're going to be acted out. If by chance someone did do something and actually hurt my horses or myself, I think people would quickly change their tune. I also find it really, really harmful that despite this being in the wake of another big influencer online ending her life because of cyberbullying, people still are lacking the capacity to critically think about the potential outcome things like this can have. I think people are banking on the fact that they don't think I'm personally at risk of doing those things, and they don't care as much because they don't see that outcome happening. When in reality, if we don't want to see people harming themselves and ending their lives over the stuff that is said online, we need to take the initiative to care about it in the moment instead of only caring about it in the aftermath. People need to be able to feel supported and believed in the moment when they are being attacked, instead of only having people express empathy in the aftermath. Because personally, regardless of how much people dislike me, I would bet money that the vast majority of these people making these threats, supporting these threats, or justifying them in any capacity, if I were to do something to harm myself, would feel guilty. I don't think that these are just evil people that actually want to physically cause someone harm and end their life. I think that there would be guilt involved if that happened, and that their intent is to say these things, try to offload whatever personal angst or anger they're feeling, and not see consequences for it. I don't think that they actually want to see someone make a permanent decision that will impact the lives of those around them. The other thing that I want to point out with this whole situation is that I rent and I live on a property where multiple people live and where people also keep their horses. So these threats against the horses and myself are such that they are personally impacting and disrupting the lives of other people. So even this notion that it's up to me to alter these behaviors and that it's up to me to change my behavior to avoid it is flawed, because people uttering these threats are disrupting the peace of other people in my life by doing so. And that's also not okay. I also want to point out the fact that I'm someone who really likes hiking with my dog and is often going out alone. My business name is on my truck, and I'm a small woman. The very notion that I even have to consider the possibility that someone wants to cause me physical harm and factor that in, even in the back of my mind while I'm hiking down a trail with a headphone in, that's insane. That is disgusting that I even have to consider that, and disrupting someone's day-to-day peace in that way should be something that none of us are condoning. So my hope is that with my platform, I can help draw awareness to these types of behaviors to make people reflect on them and reconsider how they handle things, how they speak to other people, because these things do have impact. And it's not okay to try to disrupt people's peace and actually alter how they feel about themselves and in their day-to-day life by completely just disregarding who they are as a person. And it's something where it's like, no matter how much you disagree with someone's belief systems and even with their horsemanship, because obviously, like, I take issue with abusive practices and I talk about equipment and whatnot with with people who are at the upper levels, and I'll criticize it. But like, that criticizing specific behaviors, specific actions is not the same as just walking up to someone and saying you're a terrible person and your life. Like, that's not okay. You can critique and criticize people and take issue with stuff that they do without completely trying to decimate who they are as a person, dehumanize them, and cause them physical, emotional, or mental harm. And this type of thing is something that I've seen repeatedly a lot because this was an issue in high school too, where cyberbullying was a thing and people were mean when they had the opportunity to be anonymous in any way. And it's one of those things where people stand by it and they get riled up by this mob mentality of all getting to have this shared hatred of a particular person or group of people. And then if there ever is a decision that's made that's permanent and life altering, where someone either ends their life successfully or tries to, then people are suddenly backpedaling, going silent, or expressing their condolences and feeling really guilty. And it shouldn't be something where people are all for treating someone in a way that can induce those types of responses until that permanent response happens. People should be proactive in their behavior, where if you're feeling that level of animosity towards someone and you need to get it off your chest, you can do that in a private chat. It's still very toxic and unhealthy, and I would advise against it because I don't think it's healthy for the people doing it. But you do not need to say these things publicly to people. You could write in a journal. You could type it in a Word document online. You could tell people in your personal life and rant to them. None of these remarks, threats, comments, or vicious attacks need to be said directly to the person that you're mad at. And ranting and getting it off your chest in a setting that does not impact the person that you're angry with is a lot healthier than trying to harm someone that you don't know. The other thing that I think is important to note is that the mental health behind people who are feeling this level of anger, resentment, and animosity towards complete strangers is not healthy. Like, these are not healthy minded, happy people. Feeling this level of rage to someone who you've never interacted with, do not know, and are basing your entire perception of off of what you've seen them post online or off of what other people tell you about them, that's not normal. It's not normal to do that to someone that has no actual impact on how you're living your life. And it's normal to dislike people, to disagree with people, and to maybe not vibe with their vibe. But that should not ever come to the point of physical violence or actually trying to cause someone mental distress. And like, my entire motive in bringing all of this up is to have people be more reflective and reconsider doing this to other people. It's not really about myself because eventually this is going to blow over and I'm not going to have to stress about it anymore and it'll end up going away. But if this attitude is uplifted, encouraged, and enabled, and people are able to find community in their mutual hatred of other people and banding together to behave in this way, it makes the world a much less safe place for anyone that could be a potential target of that. And I also want to note that a lot of the people that I've been seeing participate in this type of mindset are children. And obviously, I was a child once, and I was also on the internet as a child, and I know how angsty and toxic young people can be because they don't have the same capacity to reflect on their actions, regulate their emotions, and respond accordingly. And I also worry that there's young people who could be making permanent life altering decisions and putting themselves in situations where they could end up getting held legally accountable because whether people know this or not, like, even when you're making cyber threats, like if you're repeatedly bullying someone and then they end up trying to end their life or doing so, you can be held legally accountable. And then that completely destroys the future of someone who probably never actually had the intention of inciting that level of harm. So it's on all sides for people who are potential victims of this type of treatment, but also for the people perpetrating it, because I don't think that any of these people actually want to ruin their lives and ruin someone else's life just to say these types of things. And it is abusive behavior. For me, I think the most triggering thing about this is the narratives being used to justify it and the level of pressure being used. Because since I've been in abusive relationships, I've been spoken to this way by partners. I've had partners try to bully me and back me into a corner, into doing something that I didn't want to do, or admitting to something that I did not do and did not believe in. And I've been backed into corners like that by people I've been in romantic relationships with, business partnerships, and even friendships. And I acutely, like, I can decisively remember how I felt during those moments. And basically, these comments are forcing me to relive those types of emotions. Um, particularly with people trying to bully me and like threaten me and being like, oh, if you just apologize, I'll stop doing that. I've had abusive partners do basically that exact same thing to me, where the intent was to get me to apologize for their reactions and their behavior and take accountability for their behavior so that they stop abusing me. And for anyone who has been a victim of abuse, you can know how triggering that is, to be taken back to one of your traumas because of what people are doing and saying to you. And ultimately, no one deserves that. No one deserves to feel that way. No one deserves to feel backed into a corner or mistreated or to go back to situations that traumatize them. And I shouldn't have to basically plead my humanity to the world or talk about my traumas and individual experiences to humanize myself in order to avoid people speaking to me abusively. And my criticisms of horsemanship practices, political belief systems, and actions of people do not justify personal threats of violence, nor do they justify that for anybody. Plus, from a mental health standpoint, the people who are behaving that way, it's not a healthy choice for whatever it is they're feeling internally that's leading them to those types of outcomes. And the horse world in particular has created an environment that normalizes a lot of abuse and protects abusers, because we have this idea that people who are abusers are behaving with direct and deliberate malice, and that they know they're abusive and that they're doing so intentionally, and that they're basically this movie villain type of person that is behaving the way they are with the express purpose of causing harm. And that very rarely is true with abusers. Abusers find ways to justify their behaviors. They find ways to justify their actions, to basically tell the people they're abusing and themselves why their reaction was justified. They aren't doing the things they're doing thinking, I'm such an abuser. Most of the people beating their horses aren't doing those things being like, haha, I am causing this horse physical distress and I'm doing this just to be mean spirited. They justify it. And if you watch the language used to defend all these things, it's always, this horse is dangerous. They need to be put in their place or they'll hurt someone else. This horse is being disrespectful. They need to learn respect. They need to be obedient. This is for their best interest long term. They need to respond to people in order to be safe to handle. There's always an excuse. Similar with abuse towards people, there's always an excuse where it's like, oh, well, you did XYZ first. You did blah, 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 blah. Oh, I was just having a bad day. I'm just frustrated, blah, 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 blah. There's always an excuse for behavior. And usually the excuse, like in human relationships that abusers will make, is justifying their behavioral response by saying that the victim provoked them in some way. So in an abusive relationship, that can be like, oh, well, you are always starting fights. When in reality, the victim is bringing up normal conversations that need to be had and talked about in any healthy relationship. Because in a healthy relationship, if you walk up to your partner and you're like, hey, you hurt my feelings, or hey, I didn't like it when you said that, the partner will respond with empathy and compassion. And at the bare minimum, they can say, sorry, that wasn't my intention. At the bare minimum, they don't respond by yelling at you, denying and degrading and making you feel shittier. They always will respond by having that type of compassion. And even if they're initially caught off guard and defensive, it does not consistently escalate to the point of yelling and completely invalidating your perspectives, because a loving partner cares about how you feel. An abuser cares more about how they feel. And when you say something that impacts their ego or makes them feel defensive, they care the most about defending their position and they do not care about your feelings. And it's to the point where they might yell at you and it'll start this big thing and they'll be really vicious in how they respond until sometimes you start crying and then suddenly you get that compassion. And then a trauma bond is created, because when you get really upset, suddenly they're showing you empathy and compassion, and it can feel really good when you're usually getting your emotions rejected and you're getting no empathy, if that's the only way to get empathy. And then it creates this cycle where it's actually highly reinforcing to finally get empathy from your partner, even if it comes out of a really, really unhealthy discussion. And that's the nature of emotional abuse. Like, abusers very rarely will identify the fact that they are an abuser. And like, we've created this notion in society that people are aware that they're abusers, and that if you ever engage in abusive behavior, that you're just this irredeemable, terrible person. And I think that also makes it less likely for abusers to own up to their behavior, identify it, be vulnerable, apologize and actually put in the effort to fix it, because we've created this narrative that abusers are evil, bad people who are always abusive and always portray themselves as abusers and will be immediately identifiable, when that's very rarely the case. The reason why people get sucked into abusive relationships is because abusers can be very charming, they can be very kind, they pull you in by putting on a facade until they get comfortable, and then the cycle of abuse starts, and oftentimes it starts slowly. And when they pull you in by behaving differently and by being really kind, empathetic initially, by the time you're already in the relationship, you're already sucked in, and you want to believe that the person you initially met is who they really are, despite the lack of evidence that that's the case. And you can also see the humanity in them, because usually people who are abusive are coming from situations where they've been in abusive situations, where they've grown up in broken homes, where they've grown up being mistreated, and where they haven't learned how to sit with their emotions, feel their emotions, and be reflective. So if you have empathy, you can empathize with that, and you can see the humanity in someone, even when they're behaving in a really toxic and harmful way. And you're more likely to stick around and try to help them, because you see the good parts of them too. And that's the part of these abusive situations that a lot of people aren't talking about or recognizing, that every person, no matter how horrible and cruel they can be in certain settings, has humanity. They have good aspects of them. They have parts of them that humanize them and show you that they have good in them. And that's what makes it so hard to identify abuse. And that's what makes it so hard to hold abusers accountable, especially when we look at things in this really black and white way, where someone's either good or they're bad. And we also see this attitude that upholds abusive tendencies by holding people hyper accountable for things that they did in the past, even when they've done work to leave them behind. And I've seen people doing that a lot over the course of all of this drama, where people are like, well, you used to support the racing industry. You used to treat your horse badly. You used to do blah, 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 blah. You're terrible. And they're trying to liken me to being the type of person that I was a decade ago, and basically never let me move past and outlive that, despite the evidence of changed behavior. And that also makes it so that abusers are more likely to double down and refuse to change, because if they are vulnerable, they own up to their behavior, they admit that they've done wrong, and they put the work into change. If they're still going to be held to the same standard that they were when they were at their worst, then people go, what's the point in changing? Why would I do that if I'm still going to be labeled as a horrible person? So it's a twofold issue, where we need to recognize the fact that abusive behavior is not okay, that we need to hold it accountable, that we need to identify it, call it out, and hold the abuser accountable, not the victim. But we also need to look at the fact that a lot of people have grown up having abusive behaviors normalized to them, and they do not have the capacity to identify those behaviors as abusive initially, and that they need to put the work in to reflect on that, grow, and change. And if they do, we need to leave space for them to move past that. Otherwise, there's no point, because this attitude that if you've ever done anything wrong, that you're forever labeled as a horrific, terrible, abusive person, makes it so that there's virtually no point in trying to reform behavior, because you're just assuming that people can never change. And I encourage people to be critical and be cautious of people who have been abusive in the past. This is not telling people to forgive your abusers, because also the fact that people can grow, get therapy, and change and no longer behave abusively does not mean that you need to let them back in your life. It does not mean that you even need to forgive them. But you can just move past, leave them out of your life, and ignore them and leave them to continue on in theirs. But there's virtually no point in trying to modify behavior and improve the world if we don't maintain this belief that people can grow and improve as human beings, even if they've exemplified abusive behaviors in the past. It's also important to note that people can behave abusively without that being the whole of their character. There's a lot of people who are abusive towards horses that might be phenomenally kind towards people and do tons of great things in other settings. Or they might be really, really empathetic and have excellent care of other animals, but they've been indoctrinated into treating horses in such a way that it's normalized those tendencies. So there's so much nuance to the discussion. And it's not to say let abusers off the hook, but there needs to be this mindset that people can grow and change. In the horse world, I grew up having abusive training normalized to me from the time I was 4 years old. I've had people look me in the eye and tell me that at 4 years old, I should have been able to advocate for myself, stand up against adults, and hold firm in my values, which is so incredibly unreasonable and fails to acknowledge human growth patterns and how immature you are as an adolescent. Like a 4-year-old's a toddler. What type of child of like even double that age, even triple it? What type of child do you know that can actually sit back and argue with adults and hold their ground and know that they are righteous when all the adults around them are normalizing and justifying certain behaviors? It is completely out of line to assume that, and ultimately the blame for what I learned falls to the adults that modeled those behaviors to me. But even for them, they had those behaviors modeled to them when they were young and when they didn't know as much about horses either. So it's this sickness that just carries down from generation to generation, and it's hyper normalized. And that again doesn't absolve them of their actions, because ultimately once you're an adult, it's your job to start reflecting on your behavior and changing it. But it provides an explanation for why these behaviors exist, and it also humanizes the people behind them instead of just labeling them as these villains, because most of these people who are treating horses in these ways, because of how entrenched it is in equestrian culture, they're not trying to be deliberately malicious in most cases. They're not trying to be evil people. In their own way, they do love and care for their horses, but they're doing things that they've been taught to do for years. And the other component of that is that when you've learned and that something's okay and you've normalized it for years and your entire community around you is exemplifying those behaviors and you've not been exposed to much in the way of alternatives, when you suddenly start being faced with this information that what you're doing is harmful, it's really hard to sit with, because you essentially have to admit that everything you've been taught, or at least a really generous portion of it, has been harmful and that you've been harming horses for years. So initially, it's easier to deny it. It's easier to go, that can't be true, because if these signs are signs of stress in horses, that means every horse I've ever interacted with has been stressed. And initially, that seems unfathomable to believe. It seems unfathomable to believe that all of these role models and people that you believe to be experts have been wrong and have been misleading you. It seems like it cannot be true. So the first stage for most people who go through this is to deny it, is to try to justify it, is to get hyper defensive and attack people who make them feel uncomfortable, and to go, oh, you just don't know anything, you've obviously never handled a sport horse, the high level sport horse, and make excuses for their behavior. Which again goes back to the pattern and framework of abusers blaming the victim, blaming people who identify their behavior and point it out. But they're not doing so with this belief that they are actually being an abuser. So for me, undoing this pattern of what I had normalized to me, you don't just snap your fingers and suddenly become a different person. It happens in layers where you start to be like, okay, wait. And for me, one of those first major changes was when I moved my Arabian show horse out of a show barn and he was placed in a herd setting where he was on 24/7 turnout. His behavioral change was so immediate without any alterations to my training practices that it was just a very clear example of how much management and living situation for horses influences behavior. So that was the first major step that showed me that a lot of the belief systems that I had been taught to be true were not true. And having that fall before my eyes started to shift my perspective on how the horse world operates as a whole. So that started to have me question, okay, like all of these people who said that show horses need to be kept this way, and they tried to say that my horse's bolting problem and how spooky he was just his personality, they were wrong. And then that led me to be more curious of the studies that proved this, because initially when I was in denial, I sought confirmation bias. I sought to be around people who would justify my perspective, and I sought out studies that justified it as well. And I didn't want to see information that conflicted with what I wanted to believe, because it made me deeply uncomfortable. So that big shift started to really make me question things. And then from there, I started to make shifts in my care practices. The first of which was becoming very, very pro turnout and anti stalling horses for extended periods of time. And then I started to study horse behavior, and it started to call me to question a lot of the other stuff that I believed in training. And the other thing to note too is that growing up as a kid, I didn't initially start out wanting to hit horses when they were bad. I resisted initially, but then I was told by trainers, adults around me, that if I did not discipline the horse, that they would become dangerous, and then that they could hurt someone else and it would be my fault. So this again is another manipulation tactic that is emotionally abusive. It's blaming the victim, the child who's uncomfortable with having to hit a horse, with the potential outcomes of their behavior. And it's implying that if they do not hit the horse, that the horse will become dangerous, that hitting them is the only way to make the horse behave safely, despite the lack of evidence that that's the case, because anyone who's grown up in that type of setting can attest to the fact that the horses remain dangerous in a lot of ways and still repeat the same behaviors despite being hit and disciplined heavily. Yet people still continue to justify that type of treatment. The other thing to note is that when you're offered no alternative solutions other than hitting, that's all that's in your toolbox until someone else educates you or you educate yourself. So it's a really hard pattern of behavior to get out of. And something that I think needs to be celebrated is the people who put the work in to end that cycle and to move away from that type of toxic environment, because it's toxic on so many levels and there's so much to keep you in that mindset, because as soon as you start to question things and apply things differently, you become a threat to the people that were once your community and you start to get pushed out of that community. So it often necessitates moving facilities and finding communities that are more accepting of you and are not so toxic. So you end up losing these friendships, families, and environments that you've built over the course of years. So in questioning things, you have a lot to lose. And initially, when you start to lose those things, it doesn't feel like you have much to gain because you usually do not have a new community built before you start to lose the old one. And that's why a lot of people fight so heavily to maintain that community that promotes toxicity towards horses and often amongst people as well, because honestly, a lot of the worst bullying that I received and the worst treatment towards myself stems from people who promoted horse abuse and mistreatment of horses in some capacity. But it's a pattern of learning where you have to slowly just undo learned behaviors and work to release them and find alternatives, and that takes time. And I think that people need to be celebrated for even making the attempts to do that. And in celebrating their attempts to be better, that doesn't mean you need to applaud the things that they're doing that still aren't okay. You can be critical of those things even, or you can just celebrate the good and reward the behaviors you want to see. But as soon as you start punishing the very behaviors that you want to see in people, you're punishing the change and you're making it so that in questioning things, they no longer fit into their old toxic environment, but now they're also being criticized and not accepted in the new environment either. So then they have nowhere to turn to, and it's a lot easier to revert back to the people who initially accepted you and just stop changing. So we can't punish the behaviors we want to see, because ultimately anyone willing to reflect on the patterns of behavior that they've exemplified and the harm that they've potentially caused to horses is starting to put the work in, and we need to reinforce the behaviors that we want to see. So as soon as someone starts to make those efforts, that needs to be celebrated. I also want to note that a lot of the people who maintain this mindset that if you've ever done something wrong, you're forever a bad person. And again, I saw this with people being like, oh, well, you used to be in the racing industry, so therefore that means you support everything in it. Despite the fact that even when I was actively galloping racehorses, I was critical of a lot of the things in the racing industry. I was just able to look at certain things with more nuance, where I could identify the fact that these horses who were kept at the track and stable 24/7 had worse behaviors and more stress behaviors than the ones that actually got turnout. And I could also see the good in certain trainers' practices. And I also think that that's an important view to have, where you don't have to agree with everything that someone does to notice the things that they are doing right. This idea that it has to be so black and white, where you have to criticize all aspects of a human being, all aspects of their horsemanship, and just hate them as a person and never see the humanity in them and not empathize with them in any capacity in order to be against the bad things that they do, is so problematic, and it's devoid of empathy. And it's just too black and white. There needs to be nuance to this discussion. Otherwise, we lose our humanity in the process. But I went on a tangent. But what I'm getting at is the people who have this mindset that if you've ever made bad decisions in the past or believed in things that you no longer believe in, that you're a hypocrite for changing or that you're forever a bad person. Those people are not good role models, because I guarantee you that they have done things that are not okay, that they have once believed in things that are not okay. And their lack of capacity to openly acknowledge those things and hold themselves accountable is not something to be admired. This refusal to acknowledge that they have ever erred themselves is a problem. And it paints this perspective that they've just always operated with a modicum of perfection and that they've never made a mistake, which just simply is not true. It's not realistic. No one has done that. We have all done things that are not okay. We have all made mistakes that have caused people or animals harm, whether they were made, like whether we did them knowingly or intentionally or not. We have all harmed people. There's no way around that. Whether you've even been aware of it. We have all hurt people's feelings in the past, or we've done things that have scared animals or potentially hurt them. Even if it's entirely accidentally. Every single person has never lived on this planet without causing harm. But how do you respond and grow and change to knowing that you've done that? How committed are you to personal growth and taking accountability? And that's the biggest thing. Can people take accountability for their actions? Can they be self reflective and look at when they've participated in things that have caused harm and make changes accordingly? And I think that's the most telling thing. Like, the people and role models that I trust the most in my life now are the trainers who hold themselves accountable and can recognize when they've done something wrong, or when a student asks them a tough question that is kind of grading and questioning their own expertise or their own actions, they can respond to it thoughtfully and give the student an answer without being really defensive. And yes, this weaponized perfectionism is this air of superiority to basically be like, I'm better than everyone because I've never been flawed. But it's also denial. And from me, as someone who used to kind of do this in the past, where when I believed I knew the most, I actually knew the least. And it was that Dunning-Kruger effect. But I used to have this mindset that, like, oh no, I've never done anything wrong, because I was justifying all the mistakes that I did do. And it was posturing because of insecurity. It was posturing because I could not be vulnerable enough to admit where I went wrong. And it was trying to maintain my ego and my self-esteem by being in denial and never admitting to mistakes, because, like I mentioned earlier, I was fearful of being vulnerable and still being accepted when I admitted to these things, or when I admitted to being wrong. Feeling like I knew a lot was something that I held really close to my heart, and the feeling of being wrong was such a massive hit to my ego and sense of self-security that I often did everything to try to protect that. And honestly, even in recent years, it's been something in relationships where there's been aspects of myself that I have hidden from partners in the past because I felt like I wouldn't be accepted. And in abusive relationships, that was absolutely true, because I couldn't be completely transparent and be completely myself with someone who's emotionally abusing me, because they would withhold love, they would withhold affection, and they would treat me abusively if I didn't maintain this perspective of what was most palatable and lovable to them. And also, there was never any proper damage repair when there were disagreements. I would have affection withheld, I would be stonewalled, I would be mistreated. So then it was effectively just training me to be like, okay, like, if you want to be loved, you cannot do these things. But when you have a partner and you're in a healthy relationship, they accept aspects of you that are like the uglier aspects, the less perfect aspects, you on a bad day, aspects of yourself that you're ashamed of, things that you've done that you're ashamed of. Like, with my current partner, I've told him things that I've never told anyone because I was so ashamed of them that I hid them. And like, when I've told him, it was like the most underwhelming response, because he was just like, yeah, like, everyone's made mistakes. Like, no one's perfect. And it's like, it's a healthy response because it's recognizing the humanity in people and making it comfortable to be vulnerable and still be accepted even in your imperfections. And then that makes it so that you can have a healthier relationship and you can truly be yourself and still be loved, instead of feeling like that there's certain parts of your honest self that just aren't lovable. And I think for a lot of this stuff, this perfectionistic mindset that attacks people viciously for being able to recognize their mistakes and trying to label it as hypocritical to experience personal growth, it comes from a place of those people feeling like they won't be loved, appreciated, or cared for, or liked, or be able to be vulnerable and still be liked. So it comes from a place of insecurity. And it's really sad if you look at where it's stemming from, because those people do not feel safe to be honest. They don't feel safe to acknowledge the aspects of themselves that aren't imperfect. And as a result, they end up being the very type of person that has caused them to be that way to other people. And this is why I don't delete my old videos. This is why I talk a lot about the mistakes that I've made and the belief systems that I've had and things that I used to completely support that I now no longer do, because it's important to normalize the idea that you can once believe things that you now completely disagree with. We need to normalize that aspect of growth, and we need to normalize this idea that it's okay to change your perspectives, especially as you grow in age. But even if you're late to the party, like, even if you've believed in something for years and years and years, and you're like in your middle aged life, you're better off finally admitting to where you went wrong and making changes than you are taking those attitudes to your grave. And I have so much respect for people who are able to do that. Like recently, I got a comment on my community page from someone who admitted that they'd been really harsh and put down some of my belief systems before, and they apologized for it. And being able to do that at all, much less publicly, is a huge sign of someone having integrity and being a good person. Being able to publicly own up to the fact that you've mistreated someone and hold yourself accountable and still being open to considering new perspectives is a huge sign of growth and character development. And I truly respect that so much. And that applies to anyone, like any people, any trainers that I've criticized. Like I've had a lot to say about Clinton Anderson's practices because I think he is a very good example of an abusive person that speaks abusively towards horses and people. Like how he speaks about women, very abusive, very misogynistic. If he had that level of personal growth and actually owned up to any of that stuff publicly, huge respect, immediate huge respect to him if he actually did that. But he hasn't. So I'll still remain critical of his perspectives, especially what he says towards women. But like it's really hard to do, especially publicly, because it puts a target on your back, and people who are not willing to do that themselves get angry and upset. Just today, I shared a photo of me from 9 years ago because I wrote a caption that was like criticizing Donald Trump from like a decade ago when I would have been 20. And I was like, I'm proud of myself for maintaining consistent views about this man and having this type of perspective about him consistently. But the photo that the caption was paired with demonstrated horsemanship that is no longer within my belief systems. And I even remarked on that in the caption where I shared it. And yet I still got comments that were like, oh, well, like I see you using a whip and blah, 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 blah. Like learn how to do blah, 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 blah before you criticize other people. And it's like, that photo's from a decade ago. Like anyone who can sincerely look at who they were 9 years ago and say that they have not had a shred of character development should be embarrassed. That's not a flex to say that you've doubled down on your opinions to such an extent that you've seen no personal growth in almost a decade. That's not anything to be proud of. It's not anything to admire, because especially when we're talking about who you were in your early 20s or who you were in your teens, because we should not be the same person now that we were in high school. Like I'm turning 30 in January. I would be an undercooked human being if I was still the same person I was a decade ago. And we need to really like be open to that fact. And it's interesting because online it seems to be even worse, where someone has a following and they've been open about who they are and their growth online. They're almost held to a higher standard of perfection, where it's like, oh, because you shared your life online, you need to be perfect. You need to never have made these mistakes. You need to be this, you need to be that because you've chosen to share these things online. Even though a lot of people have these transgressions of character and these mistakes that they've made happen all the time in the privacy of their own life, and no one ever finds it out and they can hide them because they just haven't shared them and they haven't been as honest. And it doesn't change the fact that that those things still happened. So this mindset that we need to never change is just so incredibly unhealthy. And like do I say Melanie or Melanie? Sorry, your name has the Melanie. You're not the same person yesterday, much less 10 years ago. Like opinions are always subject to change. When I learn new perspectives and they make sense to me, my mindset is going to shift as a result. Like I'm publishing a book in the new year. By the time that book is published, it's probably going to, like, my opinions are already going to be shifting, growing, and developing, and I'll have more to say and add on to what I already wrote down. Even posts that I made like a week ago, a month ago, or whatever, like my perspectives are constantly shifting as I learn more, and that needs to be normalized because that should be the rule rather than the exception. People should be altering and changing their opinions. We also should be able to possess empathy for people, even if we don't agree with everything that they do. And the thing that I hate the most about this really black and white mindset online is that to acknowledge someone's humanity and to express empathy for how they're being treated when they're being treated unfairly, way too many people take that as supporting all of that person's views, supporting all of their belief systems, and supporting everything that they do. Like the fact that I had to preface me empathizing with the fact that Tanya and Socks have received death threats and hate with I don't agree with all of her horsemanship is fucking ridiculous, because it shouldn't matter. Someone could hit their horse on camera, and we, like, not saying that she did that, but someone could do that, and that doesn't mean that they fucking deserve death threats. That doesn't mean that they deserve to feel unsafe in their own home. And this notion that you need to be completely for or against what someone stands for is just really unhealthy, because there's nuance to everything. You can disagree with aspects of someone's character and who they are as a person without believing that they deserve to have bad things befall them. And like it just really pisses me off that there's that level of like black and white perspectives in the horse world, because it shouldn't be like that. You can be critical of aspects of someone's belief systems without believing in everything. And yeah, I completely agree. It's very obvious that Tanya loves that horse. Anyone saying otherwise is being delusional. But like again, love is not always enough. And this also is another thing that we need to be aware of in abusive relationships. A lot of abusers do, in their own fucked up way, love their partners. Like the abusive partners I was with, in their own way, they loved me, or at least the idea of me. They weren't ready to have like a pure and vulnerable and authentic love, because they were too insecure and emotionally unavailable themselves to do that. But in their own way, they did love me. They did have compassion for me in certain areas, and they did care about me in their own fucked up way. But they were still abusive. So that's the other thing, is like abusers are still capable of love. People can still make mistakes with their horses and love them deeply. When my Arab was being stalled like almost 24/7 when he was a show horse, it wasn't that I didn't love him. When I was using harsh bits on him, it wasn't that I didn't love him. I've always loved my horses. That doesn't mean I've always made the best decisions for them. And we need to be able to separate those two things, because you can love someone or something and still not make all the right decisions for them and still cause them harm. Love doesn't cancel out the potential to cause harm. And more people need to be admitting that. But also, we need to look at things with compassion, because if the goal is to change the horse world, reform people's thinking, and leave the door open for personal growth, and like we need to help people be inspired to change by recognizing the fact that you can both love your horse and make decisions that are not in their best interest. And when we do not do that, and we just create this thing where it's like someone doesn't always do what's best for their horse, therefore they are a villain, it doesn't inspire change. And it is really hard. Like, I get frustrated with a lot of stuff that's normalized at the upper levels. My biggest frustrations lie with the organizations that enable that type of treatment, because ultimately I think they are the most complicit, because they are setting a standard of what's normal. So a lot of my frustration lies with the FEI. But it's hard to not get frustrated when you see the level of abuse that's being normalized. But even with that said, you got to acknowledge that a lot of these people in their own way love their horse, even if that love has kind of altered to be more about the love of the sport than the love of the horse. And that's the case for a lot of people in the top levels of sport, because of what's been normalized and rewarded to them. But people are largely a product of their environment. And yeah, like someone said, now that you say that, I think that's also an issue when people think of Charlie Kirk. Some people aren't able to understand that disliking what someone stands for doesn't mean you wish for bad things to happen. I agree. Like, my video on him, I've had multiple people accuse me of justifying his death or advocating for his death. No part of that video does that. I criticize his behavior in life and say that I'm not actively mourning him, but that doesn't mean that I am endorsing the violence. And I actually explicitly state the opposite. And that's the other thing, is people try to weaponize that to suggest, like, and they use it only in their advantage, where it's always holding the people that they wish to support to far less standards than what they hold other people to. So there's a lot of irony in that, because a lot of people are like, just because you don't agree with Charlie Kirk doesn't mean he deserves to die. And I'm like, you're correct. That's absolutely correct. However, a lot of the same people who commented that on my Charlie Kirk video are now saying, you brought this upon yourself. You brought these death threats upon yourself. So this selective logic and selective application of right and wrong is also an abuse tactic. It's a manipulation tactic. Justice for me, but not for thee. I hold you to a standard that I'm unwilling to hold myself or people that I support to. And there's this lack of consistency. And what I wish people would notice is that despite the fucking shitty ass messages that I've got and the nasty comments that I've got, I have not wished violence, harm, or cruelty on anyone that has done that. I've not wished for harm to befall them. I've not wished for their life to be shittier because they don't fucking deserve that. Anyone willing to make those comments is already having a shitty enough life if they feel that way. And they don't need more bad stuff to happen. I wish that they weren't toxic and harming people, but there's this notion where people are holding those that they dislike and those that make them uncomfortable and question stuff to a far greater standard of what they hold themselves or other people they support to. And this is something that I've consistently noticed within a lot of these people who are upholding and supporting people who perpetuate harmful rhetorics. They can identify harmful behaviors in other people when they do not like them. And they hold people to such an insane standard where it's like, you can never have made a mistake ever. You can never have said something I don't agree with ever. Meanwhile, when it's someone they do like, it's always, that's out of context. They didn't mean that. They're a good person. They didn't deserve that. And justifying all of their behavior, even when that behavior is abusive. Meanwhile, people who react to abuse are held to a standard of they always have to say things perfectly, never have to say things something slightly off, always have to be above board, never doing anything wrong in order to be deserving of empathy. But on the flip side, they never hold their own favorites to that level. And I have probably above average pattern recognition because I have autism. And it's something that I just consistently notice in people who are defending these types of people, these types of individuals, these types of leaders in the community where they are able to identify what they feel is abusive behavior in other people, and they hold victims to a point of accountability where it's like, oh, you should never even call out someone who's mistreated you. You should never bring that to light. You should just stay quiet and just take it, or you're equally as complicit. And it's the same type of idea as blaming victims who react to abuse. Because if you're being repeatedly abused by your partner, there are going to be times where you yell back, where you snap and you might say something that's mean, but that doesn't mean that you are the abuser in the relationship. There's a huge difference between being pushed to your limit and snapping back at someone who's been actively abusing you and being the active abuser who's been manipulative and emotionally, physically, or whatever abusing someone. And that's also something that gets lost in nuance, where I notice people who are supportive of abusers consistently nitpick how victims react. Meanwhile, they justify similar and worse behaviors in abusers. And it is so incredibly toxic and unhealthy. And it's not okay. So I encourage people to notice these patterns because regardless of what you think, I don't fucking care if people agree with anything that I say. I don't deserve death threats. My horses don't deserve to be harmed. And making those kinds of threats impacts other people in my life who are not online and who you do not fucking hate. And it is causing them stress and anxiety too. And if you truly do not have the capacity to empathize with those people and be understanding and acknowledge the fact that it has the capacity to cause other people harm. Also, on top of this, I've been contacted by parents who've had kids that have been horrifically bullied and have stated how triggering it is to watch this and how it has upset their child to watch this and how it has caused harm to watch this. Other victims of abuse. So if you fucking care about anyone, you should not be justifying this type of treatment. And yeah, that's it. Yeah, this is a great quote too from this commenter. People want perfect, beautiful victims. The moment a victim's suffering isn't aesthetic, they freak out. And yeah, I think that's a lot of the reason why people don't like what I say too, because I say things a little bluntly and I make them uncomfortable. And I think people confuse their discomfort with things that I criticize with being bullying. Like criticizing behaviors and actions and saying I don't agree with this is not the same as saying you're a fucking terrible, irredeemable person, you suck. Which I've never said because I have the capacity to understand that everyone can change. Everyone can grow as a human being. Everyone can become better. And I truly hope that they do because what I've been witnessing online these last couple months is not indicative of healthy people. It is not indicative of people who are happy and well fulfilled in their lives. It's not indicative of people who have the capacity to self reflect. One thing I want to point out is that one of my biggest concerns with this whole thing and with how people behave online and with like the defense of any type of figure who has heavily criticized marginalized groups of people is that they have the capacity to empathize with people who abuse their platforms to cause harm and deliberately target already vulnerable communities. And they empathize with the people who are putting at-risk people more at risk. But they do not show the same capacity to empathize with those at-risk people, which means their empathy is subjective and it typically really only applies to people that they identify with and see themselves in. And that is a problem in itself, because it shouldn't be a situation. If it's truly about empathizing and worrying about people who are potential risks of violence, it should apply to everyone. It should apply to people you don't agree with, people with different political views, people whose sexual orientation and gender identity you do not understand. None of those people deserve to be victims of violence. It shouldn't have to be someone who looks like you, talks like you, and supports the same perspectives as you. That's not empathy. That's you protecting what you identify with and protecting the people who you feel are advocating for people like you, and also trying to protect your own belief systems, because a lot of it's very telling, because those people want to feel comfortable in being critical and like prejudiced towards marginalized people. That's why they tend to defend the people who attack those types of people, because they feel validated in harboring those types of biases. So then they're comfortable defending people like that, but then they don't extend the same type of advocacy or empathy towards people who are similar victims of violence but living different lives. And for me, like, I think that obviously everyone has bias, but I think that my capacity for nuance differs from a lot of people online because of the fact that I'm biracial and that I have experienced immense trauma, and that I also struggle with like mental health issues, and I'm neurodivergent. Like, I fit into the fringes of a lot of different marginalized groups, and it has put me in environments where I've gotten to talk to people and learn about their struggles in a way that differs from a lot of other people, and it's put me outside of my community and caused me to understand what other people are going to a greater degree than what people who are maybe too uncomfortable to leave their personal comfort zone are able to do. And I also do think that my position as a biracial person, despite being exceptionally white passing, opens me up to behaviors that are rooted in some level of racism and prejudice and discrimination, because people do not like how I make them feel uncomfortable. And while they might not be targeting me for my skin color, their bias against me is steeped in some level of discrimination because of those things, because I speak for those things, and because I speak on behalf of marginalized people, and they do not like it. And honestly, all of these people could show their work if they truly do care about everyone. It's really easy to advocate for marginalized people just as hard as you advocate for people who look like you. For me personally, like, I try to make a habit of uplifting voices that are traditionally erased in the media. And a lot of people don't do that, but they want to maintain this persona of caring about everyone and being an advocate. But really, advocacy should be about advocating for the people who are the most voiceless and the most underrepresented, not the people who get the most media attention and empathy and have the most societal protections overall. And again, I have to go take Lynn to the vet in a second. But this all comes back to the fact that, like, anyone who is justifying these threats of violence towards me when I'm small, I'm a woman, I'm a biracial woman, I'm neurodivergent, and they're justifying them on the basis that I criticize someone else first, you are promoting violence. You are basically saying that people are deserving of the violence that's inflicted on them or threatened to be so if they do not have the same perspectives as you, if they dare to criticize anyone who's different than them. And it would be a more valid statement to make if my criticisms had been threats of violence, which they were not, never have been. But it's really hypocritical, because this type of behavior should just never be acceptable. Especially if they were able to see that humanity in someone else. And I think that's the irony of this whole situation, is I've been able to see the lack of consistency in a lot of people's perspectives and how often they contradict themselves, and how ironic it is for this to all have stemmed from the fact that people took me criticizing Charlie Kirk's behavior in his life as condoning his death, despite saying the opposite of that, and them saying that people don't deserve to die or have their lives threatened for their belief systems. But now those same people are justifying me having my own well-being and life threatened. I am Canadian. I do not really speak French. We had to learn it in school. I speak very, very little French because I forgot it all, and I do regret that. I wish I knew a second language, but unfortunately, I do not. I can understand some of it, but I cannot. I do not even speak well enough to get by. But anyways, I encourage people to reflect on this because also I would hate for anyone that is currently condoning this to have to learn the hard way. And I would hate more for the victim of them learning the hard way because learning the hard way in this context is bullying someone into a permanent decision or causing severe emotional distress and harm. And regardless of how you feel about someone, if you are comfortable with the idea of having them be uncomfortable in their own house, uncomfortable in their own life, having to look over their shoulder, having to fear potential violence inflicted on themselves or their animals, that's not being a good person. And you need to do some serious inner work if you think that that's okay, because it's never okay. And on my following end, I don't agree with personal attacks. I don't agree with being petty or attacking someone in a way that is not constructive whatsoever. I don't believe that criticizing behavior is a personal attack whatsoever. If you're criticizing things that someone has actually done and saying why you have a problem with it, that's a lot different than personally attacking or threatening someone. I do not condone that behavior with anyone, and I've consistently tried to state that in this situation. Um, and it's not what I stand for. And I am pretty appreciative of the fact that my following has largely reflected that. So thank you guys for having those same values and knowing where to draw the line. Do they teach Salish language as First Nation people in Southwest British Columbia in school? They didn't when I was in school, but they do have more First Nation studies in school now. But I'm not sure to what extent because I'm no longer in high school or elementary school. But anyways, I got to go take Lynn to the vet. See you later, everybody. Have a good night or day. And I hope that that lands for people. And if you've been abused, I'm sorry. I got your back. I know how shitty it is. And if any of this has been triggering you, I'm very sorry. But I want to lend voice to victims and stop normalizing doing things that deliberately benefit abusers, because that's what this situation is it's not about me, it's about the greater issue. This is fucking helping abusers be abusive and making them feel validated in their behavior by blaming the victims for how they reacted or what they did to potentially trigger those responses. Never okay. If you feel the need to physically threaten someone with violence because they pissed you off with a criticism or a belief system, go to fucking therapy. Thank you. Bye.